Hello, everyone, and welcome. The masterclass will begin shortly. Thanks for joining.
Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Thanks for joining us wherever you are. Maybe you could drop in the chat box where you're dialing in from today. We love to see a bit of global representation, so it'd be great to see where you're joining us from.
Indeed. Amazing to see how many people log in. Welcome, everyone. Just saying that the masterclass will start shortly. Yeah. Oh. And as Faith just mentioned, feel free to write in the chat box where you're from. It's great to hear where you're from, everyone.
Nice. Cyprus, Lisbon, DC, Montreal, Copenhagen, represent. Love it. Welcome, everyone.
Turkey. Norway, and you had the Northern Lights. It's amazing. We actually had that in Denmark shortly as well. I didn't get to see it though. Berlin, US, amazing.
Kenya, India, someone else from Turkey.
Seattle.
It feels good to be in community with you all. Thanks so much for joining.
And again, welcome everyone who's joining. We will start shortly. We'll just allow a couple of seconds more for people to join in because we can see that there's a lot of people joining. Very excited to have you all here. Thank you so much. Venezuela, China. It's really interesting to see how global this you all are from attendees. It's amazing. All right. Hello, everyone again. Thank you for joining. We will start the masterclass soon. All right. I think we will slowly start now. Thank you so much, everyone, that you are watching in on this session. This is the second GFA Academy masterclass on the GFA Monitor just to make you all aware, this masterclass will be recorded and shared afterwards. And please, everyone who log in, feel free to write in the chat where you're from. We can already see now that we have a really global representation. And I'm here together with my lovely colleague, Faith. So just to start out, my name is Christina. I work as a head of academy, so in charge of all the masterclasses we do, among other things. And this is the second masterclass, as I just told you about. It's going to be on better weight systems, which is an incredible, important topic in the industry that we're really excited to have a panel about today with really esteemed speakers. So going forward, GFA will host several masterclasses, and we're really excited about this. And so far, it has been a great success, and everyone has been quite keen on it. And I just want to mention, if you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear them. There is a Q&A where you can send us questions too. Please send them in here, and feel free to write where you're from in the chat. So to start with, I mentioned the GFA Monitor report. We have the person from our team who is the master of that, and that is Felicity, my colleague. So she'd love to actually give us some in-depth thought about what this is about, better wage systems. So I'll hand it over to you, Felicity.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Felicity Lammas. I'm the Sustainability Manager at Global Fashion Agenda. And as Christina mentioned, my role is really focusing on the research and the writing of our core publications. And I'll just be kicking off today with a very short presentation on GFA's latest publication, the GFA Monitor, and just a brief deep dive into the topic of better wage systems to really set us up for today's panel discussion. So next slide. Great. So last year in June at Global Fashion Summit in Copenhagen, we launched our first GFA Monitor publication. And this is really intended as an industry resource for fashion's leaders to drive urgent and bold action towards a vision of a net positive fashion industry. And how we define that at GFA is one which puts back more into society, the environment, and the global economy than it takes out. And the GFA Monitor really builds on an existing framework GFA already had set in the Fashion CEO agenda. And this really outlines priority areas on where action should take place. And going forward, we really see the GFA Monitor as one which will act as an industry gauge, providing data-backed industry progress data on where the industry currently stands on the priority areas that we speak to in the report. The GFA Monitor, just to note, is a freely downloadable resource on the GFA website. So please, if you have not already, do go and download it. So next slide, please. So to consolidate industry insights in the GFA Monitor and really understand where the industry currently stands in terms of progress, as well as what industry resources already exist that we can leverage, we engaged over 20 credible industry organizations. You can see just a snapshot of these on the screen here. In the center, we have our impact partners. Each of them head up one of the 5 priority areas. So we've got Apparel Impact Institute, Anna MacArthur Foundation, Fair Labour Association, who are joining us today, Social and Labour Convergence Programme and Textile Exchange. Below that, we have a much broader principal stakeholder list who also supported in the co-creation of the GFA Monitor content. And Higg, who's also on the panel today, supported us with a presentation of aggregated performance data across the 5 priority areas. Our strategic partners and our associate partners also acted as a sounding board for the publication and provided their best practices in the form of tangible case studies. Next slide, thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our core publications, so that being the Fashion CEO agenda and the GFA Monitor, we build our work around this 5 priority holistic framework. So it focuses on respectful and secure work environments, better wage systems, resource stewardship, smart material choices, and circular systems. And on to the next slide. This is just a snapshot. Don't expect everyone to try and read this in any depth, but this is a snapshot of our executive summary from the GFA Monitor. And this really shows you how we've designed each chapter within the report. So we start with providing a definition and more context to each priority area. We outline the opportunities for the industry, and then we outline the top actions that we believe the industry should action in those areas in order to achieve that vision of a net positive fashion industry. Next slide, please. So today our session is focusing on the topic of better wage systems. And in better wage systems, we provide guidance on how to ensure the necessary systems to enable suppliers to pay all workers fair compensation or a living wage underpinned by fair purchasing practices and workers' rights to freedom of association, which will really help to bring millions of garment workers out of poverty. So as we'll discuss in today's panel discussion today, there is already several, there's the industry is making huge strides to promote living wages and fair compensation throughout the value chain, but as we all know, progress to date still remains very slow. The current wages in most garment producing countries is currently far below what a worker needs to achieve a decent standard of living or a living wage. And one of the structural barriers, perhaps why this progress is so slow, is that many fashion brands today do not directly control the wages of workers and rather depend on their supply chain actors to really affect the change. However, we all know and we believe that fashion brands can play a huge role in working with their supply chain actors and to really ensure the enabling environments for fair compensation and better wages to be paid to those garment workers. So in the GFA Monitor, as you can see on the screen, we outline 4 key areas for action that we believe the industry must prioritize. So that's the adoption of responsible purchasing practices that reflect direct and indirect labour costs in supplier payments and support long-term partnerships with manufacturers, enabling the implementation of the rights to freedom of association and promote collective bargaining agreements which ensure reasonable wage growth, promoting wage parity by putting mechanisms in place to enable all workers to partake in wages and benefits that have been negotiated regardless of race, gender, nationality. And lastly, promoting wage protection and security, such as the adoption of digital wage payments and implementing responsible order exit processes and policies. Next slide, please. Great. So just to show you what we really include in the GFA Monitor under this priority area, we direct the industry towards credible industry tools and resources that they can already adopt and implement their work to really drive forward those best practices. And we also include several case studies to show you what existing actors are already doing to action in this space. Next slide. And just lastly, we also tap into the legislative environment and what policy changes the industry can prepare for going forward, and also a highlight on where the industry currently stands in terms of progress. So looking into what primary data is already available and known within the industry to where the industry currently stands and where action really needs to take place. Last slide, please. So yeah, I'll wrap up now and pass back over to Christina. But as I mentioned, the GFA Monitor publication is available freely to download on our website. So please do go and download it after this session. But otherwise, I hope everyone has a great panel discussion, and please do send any questions via the chat and we'll be sure to answer them during the session.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Felicity, for the definition and so on. That's really really helpful for everyone out there. And meanwhile Felicity spoke, I can see that we have had more people join in, so please welcome everyone and put your questions in the Q&A, and please write in the chat where you're from. We're super excited to have you here. And that's enough from me. I want to head it over to Faith, who sits right next to me, who's the moderator of this session.
Thank you. Thanks, Felicity. Hey, everyone. I'm Faith, and I'm the head of content at GFA, and I'm very excited for today. I can't wait to pick the brains of these amazing panelists. We have an amazing group of people here, but before we jump into the panel, I'm just going to hand over to Tiffany Rogers, who's the director at Fair Label Association. Tiffany's just going to provide even more context really on some of the different solutions and tools that is a part of her work, and that's also part of the GFA Monitor. So hey Tiffany, how are you? Welcome, and can't wait to hear from you.
Thanks, Faith, and thanks, Christina and Felicity, and to everyone for joining today. As Faith mentioned, I'm Tiffany Rogers, the Director of Fair Compensation and Member Engagement at the Fair Labor Association, and really do just want to give a great thanks to the Global Fashion Agenda for hosting today's masterclass on better wages. I'll just jump in because we have a great panel of speakers that will allow for a bit more lively debate on the landscape of living wages in the fashion industry. But first, on the Fair Labor Association, we work directly with businesses to remediate labor rights violations in their supply chains and improve their social compliance and purchasing practices programs to respect human rights. We largely work in two industries: manufacturing in the fashion industry and agriculture at the farm level, with companies in coffee, cocoa, and hazelnuts. And in addition to businesses, our standards and strategies are informed by a multi-stakeholder framework, including colleges and universities and civil society and unions. Next slide. So as the Director of Fair Compensation and Member Engagement, I do have a pretty exciting job to lead the implementation of our fair compensation strategy, and have really benefited from great leaders and experts that really set the foundation of this work at Fair Labor Association. We've been on quite the journey to implement our fair compensation standards over the past decade within our company's codes of conduct and actual measuring and reporting of progress. For fair compensation, we're talking about workers' right to have wages that meet their basic needs and provide some savings within the regular work week. So the right to earn a living wage without overtime. And we developed a wage data collection tool and our online fair compensation dashboard that allows for our members to measure their living wage progress using the Global Living Wage Coalition estimates and inform their fair compensation and living wage blueprints, an operational action plan that coordinates and actualizes the company's commitment to living wage and fair compensation. Last year, all Fair Labor accredited companies made a public commitment to these standards and provided information to how they're implementing them. And we're now focused on public reporting and wanting to ensure progress is part of that reporting. Last but not least, we joined the Global Living Wage Coalition Action Network in 2022 to affirm this commitment and work with other organizations on living wage. Next slide. So here's just a snapshot of our wage data collection tool. It's an Excel-based model that is straightforward and scalable, allowing companies to gather worker wage data from factories in the apparel, footwear, and accessory supply chains. Our methodology is based on the book Living Wage Around the World, written by founders of the Anchor Research Institute, Richard and Martha Anchor. And in the tool, we are collecting different payment types, including basic wages, which can be hourly or piece rate, incentive pay, in-kind and cash benefits, taxes and deductions, and overtime and leave pay. This tool is currently publicly available at no cost for companies to measure their living wage gap in supply chains. You can download it on the FLA website, and Roshu has just dropped the link in the chat. And truly, you can have a tool to start collecting wage data today. We've provided this tool for free for the fashion industry so that we can move forward and bring transparency to workers' wages. Next slide. So another cool system that we've developed is our fair compensation dashboard. And you can kind of see the demo in the slide. It allows for companies that have used our Excel wage tool to upload and analyze the wages against the Global Living Wage Coalition estimates and other benchmarks. The dashboard allows for companies to analyze their average workers' wages per month, measure those wages against living wage benchmarks, and track progress year over year. We include wage benchmarks for 32 countries, which allow users to measure various wage progress, including their living wage gap. And this tool does require a subscription to use, and we're happy to provide more information to companies that are interested on that. Next slide. And so as of today, all fair labor companies and suppliers are using FLA's Fair Compensation Toolkit, along with a handful of non-FLA companies as our subscribers to the dashboard. We're proud that over 50 companies in the fashion industry are using our tool to collect wage data, analyze the living wage gap, and make progress to close that gap. Next slide. And so this is just some wage data from our dashboard and looking at the trends in Vietnam. And just for a little bit more context, we launched our dashboard in February 2020, and that timing was pretty crucial because it really did allow for our members to mobilize wage data collection during a very crucial time in the pandemic. We knew that wages were going to be in flux for workers because of the mandatory shutdowns and supply chain disruptions, and that while it was a bit chaotic for everyone, that was a real important need for our companies to start taking this issue more seriously and making sure that they could measure the impact to workers with using our tools. It wasn't an easy effort, and yet we did get all of our companies to collect wage data in 2020 so that we could understand how workers were being impacted. So here on the screen, we have the FLA average net wages across our members who collected data in their factories from 2019 to 2021. This analysis includes about 340 factory data sets, 96 from 2019, 103 from 2020, and 141 in 2021. And we see a trend that's not really surprising to us. We can see that workers' wages decreased from 2019 to 2020, about 4%, and then had about a limited 2% recovery in 2021. So that's about a decrease of $11 per month for a worker from 2019 to 2020, and an increase of $6. So really still having a $5 gap from the wages that they earned back in 2019. And that's not including inflation, that's just the numbers. And so for everyone on the call, if any of us were earning $5 less now than we were in 2019, we'd be pretty frustrated with that. And so that really just emphasizes, the frustration that workers have within the supply chains, but also it's clear now that we have the tools, we really do need to focus on solutions and how to improve wages, especially coming out of the pandemic. Next slide. And so I want to get to our panel. So we do have a lot of work that we're doing on living wage interventions and improving wages. So there's a little QR code there on our case study on excessive overtime, where we found that you can improve progress towards living wage if you are remediating excessive overtime violations in a factory. And there's some cool learnings in the 3 factories that we focused our case study in that report. You can also take a listen to our OECD side session that we had a couple of weeks ago, which largely emphasizes the current project we have going on right now in Vietnam, where we are working with factories that have multi-buyers and working with them to test solutions on how to improve wages within multi-buyer facilities, because we understand that can also be a barrier to improvement as well. But all to say that we've kind of showcased our tools around how to measure progress and report on progress, and that will be our goal for the Fair Labor Association this year, is really ramping up our efforts to publicly report from FLA, but also give the guidance to our companies on how to do that, and really start to focus more on how to drive progress and making sure that we're improving wages for workers, and also the purchasing practices that need to support that. So with that, I think I pass it back to Faith.
Yeah, thanks a million, Tiffany. Wow, damn, thanks for the context. The tools seem really incredible, and thanks for being part of the GFA Monitor as well. So let's get into it. Let's do this panel discussion. We've got more or less half an hour, and that's going to include questions, which we'll take towards the end of that time. So for the esteemed panelists we have here, quick reminder just to keep it short, really, and concise on the answers. That would be amazing. So let's begin. We've got Ayesha, James, and Tiffany, and yeah, I'm Faith, and I'll be moderating. So if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to get right into it and take my first question to you, James. So we saw quite a lot of data there, a few different data sets, and when it comes to tech, I would love it for you to very briefly set the scene and tell us why those metrics for driving better wage systems in this kind of complex area, why is that more difficult than the more environmental challenges in the binary terms?
Faith, thanks so much for starting off with such an easy question. I'm
Go on.
very, very honored to be here. Hi, everyone. James Schaffer, Chief Strategy Officer at Higg. I think, as everyone knows, at Higg, we're working hard to use data and technology to scale best practices. And I have to say, much of that boils down to creating transparency between brands and their supplier partners. I really resonated with Tiffany's presentation. I think that's a really effective approach. We have a slightly different approach, but it boils down to the same thing. Our focus is, of course, bifurcated between environmental and labor practices. That's the point of the methodology behind our tools. And it's evident, I hope, in the inherent data sharing nature of our platform. But as you're alluding to, Faith, this is a lot more challenging on the social side than on environmental matters. And it actually doesn't even require a technology point of view to see this. At Higg, and I think other tool owners and providers have seen this as well, there's just much more uptake of the environmental tools. I think for even decades, you could say there have been really clear ways to collect primary data on environmental practices and really clear interventions to improve environmental impact. That's true of our environmental tool and other known environmental assessment. I think the result that we see in environment is really deep alignment around the goals. I would say even the science, the interventions, the approach to measurement. So like if you're a factory manager and you know your energy source and your consumption per volume of production, it's pretty easy to identify realistic goals and appropriate interventions to do that. It's a straightforward conversation. But if you try that on the analog, on a question of wages or fair wages, you're going to hear a bunch of different qualifiers that obfuscate the matter. And it's made it really challenging for industry stakeholders to make progress. So thanks to the work of organizations such as represented on this panel, we are making progress. In environment, we also have big industry level, like science-based targets, thanks to the work of organizations like the SAC or Textile Exchange, the work of WRI, and these come with really clear interventions by Clean by Design, like Clean by Design and other programs such as from Fair Labor and Remake, et cetera. But again, if you try the analog of that for fair wages, the slogans and the goals at an industry level get a little harder to write. So I'd say with social impact, there's simply less alignment. There's a lot of disparity. You have some brands using industry level programs like SLCP and Fair Labor Association, and many others are using custom approaches, or frankly, some are using nothing at all if you really dig into it. I'd say the fact is, and this is where it's a little bit ironic that this is called a masterclass. No matter how many years you spend on this issue, I think it's a stretch to call anyone a master. We have to approach this really humbly, because this is an issue that is at a minimum 150 years old. I could make a case that it's hundreds of years old. It's a topic that has a lot of confusing and opposed incentives, and a lot of other challenges. I would say, though, to flip it to the positive, this industry has a massive opportunity in the coming few years to dramatically improve how it collects data. We saw Fair Labor Association's tool. We have tools as well, so that the data becomes standardized, scalable, extensible, interchangeable, and ultimately effective for painting a clear picture of how the industry is doing on fair wages, and then what the proper interventions are and how can we tell if we're actually succeeding or if we're just stuck in marketing slogans.
Thank
So
you.
I think just to close my comment, I think we have to move away from rudimentary tools and start adopting really scalable technological interventions.
Okay, thanks so much for basically putting some framing around where you're coming from with this conversation. I would love to hear from Ayesha. Hi, it's so great to welcome you to this masterclass. Thank you so much for joining. And I wanted to open up to you and just ask, from your point of view and your work, why does fashion struggle so much on this issue? You have made such an amazing point in our prep call, which was that centering pay equity in the climate conversation is difficult for fashion. Why do you think that is?
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation. When it comes to why fashion struggles so much, I really think it's because we have been engaged over the last 30 years to a race to the bottom when it comes to putting a downward pressure on labor cost. And I think this is true whether high street or luxury brands, that at the end of the day, what you're seeing, as you saw in Tiffany's slides, is that the size of the gap between living wages and the ability to afford a decent quality of life has grown. And we've particularly seen it in this context of inflationary pressures. I think at a meta level, it comes down to garment work is high skilled work, and yet our industry does not treat workers as the high skilled essential workers that they are. we have seen the industry find a lot of value when it comes to, say, reorganizing design or having value gains from production planning, but not so much when it comes to wage levels. And, we started this conversation, you noted, that we don't make progress on wages because brands do not directly control wages of their contracted workers. And to be honest, I sort of push back on that argument, because at the end of the day, it's the prices that brands pay. It's the FOB price that results in the direct downward pressure. And so what do we do? Here we really hear two arguments, right? And I'd say these arguments are also 30 years old. The first is to say, well, multiple buyers can't influence prices in a single factory. And then the other red herring that's often tossed out is, well, because of antitrust concerns, we can't share prices by factories. And so what ends up happening is that we're currently stuck in the conversation of data and research and pilot projects, with brands simply not making progress, even against their own stated living wage goals, because we look at their sustainability reports and we see year over year that you're not making progress. A lot of the conversation now, whether it comes to ring fencing labor costs or I'm using an open costing model, is again really mired and focused on minimum wage compliance, whereas we just haven't seen any efforts around living wages, how that's written in, how that's paid, and how that's verified. And I know we're going to get to solutions, but really I think at the end of the day, this comes down to commercial practices. First, there's nothing preventing brands from disclosing actual monthly earnings by job type, with breakouts for overtime, bonuses, piece rates. It's not to say disclosure is going to get us to living wages, but it's an important start. Factories post what they're going to pay by wages outside their walls. And so to say this is proprietary information is simply not true. And as long as it's stuck within industry associations, within efforts where the data is only shared by companies and not in the public domain, we're not going to make progress. So I'd say the first, what we need is disclosure. The second is, you have seen a growing number of brands putting more of their production into strategic suppliers. And so if you have 80% of production in a particular factory, why not influence wages? Why not put more of your spend where factories are unionized, where there are collective bargaining agreements in place? And at the end of the day, we really have to have a conversation around fair model contracts. Why do we not have more brands with buyer codes of conduct when we have supplier codes of conduct? And why don't we look at the way that brands are able to essentially put all the risk of commercial practices onto factories, who in turn place that risk onto workers? That's why I think we haven't made progress, because we're having the wage conversation outside of how prices are set, how contracts are set. And that disconnect lets us to sort of push all the pressure down to the factories when all the value creation sits up top.
Thank you so much. It's so hard to summarize all of the invaluable nuance that you're sharing in your answer. But what the takeaways are for me right now is this push for disclosure, really moving the risk within the value chain, and really digging into what commercial practices should look like. So over to you, Tiffany. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I just wondered if you wanted to respond to anything you heard, and also just ask what this growing momentum, I mean, we've had so many people sign up to this masterclass. It's fantastic. What's this growing momentum say about where the industry is going in terms of better wages?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate the comments from Ayesha and James. I think to James' point that this issue has been around for over 150 years, kind of brings me back and grounds me a little bit to think about the momentum that we're picking up, because I'm a young person, so I've been working on this for about 10 years. And the important piece there is really, for me, along with everyone on this call, is that we do need to learn from the experts and those that have kind of set the groundwork moving forward. But then we can't get into we can't get bogged into the kind of some of the debates that have delayed progress on this issue. And some of that has been around like what living wage estimate to use, how do you calculate it? At the FLA, we did a lot of work to kind of kind of leapfrog over some of those debates because they frankly were just kind of wasting time. You know, I think a lot of people want to process information and debate it, and that's great. But for us, it was really about what are the data points that we need to know in order to measure progress, and then how do we collect that in a way that is scalable, so we aren't you know, doing so much time and energy around just data collection, so that we could focus on moving forward and collaborating with those that are wanting to make progress on this issue. So, you know, with the growing momentum, I think it's been really excited for FLA to be able to showcase what is possible when we do focus on living wage and think about it as something that can be meaningfully improved upon and not just talked about and debated on. And then I think the other point that Ayesha raised around a lot of some of the, you know, the red herrings and the third rails that, you know, people don't want to talk about, but we really need to get to with antitrust. I mean, in the US, that is a huge area of sensitivity for us. So what that meant at FLA is we had to develop data systems to make sure we were avoiding any antitrust risk, making sure that we're informed on how to kind of manage those boundaries, and then structure discussions, debate, data collection, trainings, things like that, with all of that in mind, because to Ayesha's point, workers' wage data point is not proprietary information. I think, you know, there's been a lot of great work on costing, and that's really important as well. But we have found, especially because when we're talking about living wage, we're talking about the right to earn wages within regular time, not overtime. And with costing, you're looking at, you know, the overall labor cost. So that includes your regular wages along with the overtime wages. And so, you know, to Ayesha's point, that is a compliance exercise to make sure that workers are earning the minimum wage, the contracted wages that they signed up to, including incentive pay or bonuses, but also the overtime wages, because we know that is also an issue, that not all workers receive the legally mandated overtime that they should be earning. But for living wage, we need to look at what they make during the regular work week within that 48-hour week, and make sure that that can be enough that affords their basic needs and give them some savings. And so for us, it was going beyond just costing, but looking at responsible purchasing practices as a whole, from planning, design, development, and then production and sourcing, and especially with material procurement as well, because all of those kind of levers kind of influence how much time the factory has to make the product. And if they are planning with overtime, then they will usually have excessive overtime in those factories. And it will be hard for factories to actually make living wage progress, because those overtime rates are usually 2 to 3 times more than the regular wage. So we found that they put downward pressure on wages. Maybe I'll wrap up my comment is the one thing that I'm always kind of concerned and cognizant about is making sure that we're putting workers at the forefront of our work, and making sure that what we're doing is positively impacting them, and how we can improve on that. So how we support union engagement and collective bargaining, I think, is really important. But also, and what we're doing in our pilot is, how do you engage with workers about talking about living wage? Because everyone's perspective can be different on this topic. And so how do workers understand living wage? What does it mean for them to have a job that pays a living wage, or is at least striving to pay a living wage? And how do we bring those learnings and important points into the work that we're doing with businesses?
Thank you, Tiffany. Again, I'm really blown away by the kind of commitment and depth of intention that I'm hearing from this panel. It's so inspiring to me, especially when sometimes we can feel like this topic isn't really, you know, kind of like personally sometimes quite repetitive, or feel like we're always working so hard, and sometimes it's very intangible to understand where we're going. So that's what I'm getting out of this. I have a couple more questions. We don't have that much time. So again, a reminder just to try and be quite concise, which is so difficult with this topic to cram into an hour. But Ayesha, back to you. One of the things that I've heard a lot around this topic is that we talk about it more than we act on it. So I wanted to offer, I wanted to hear more about your work, really, and see if you could give a very like small case study of some of the work that you've done to help fashion keep accountability towards its workers.
Yeah, absolutely. I will speak fast because I'm eager to get in conversation with all the lovely questions that are coming in. You know, at the start of the pandemic, the industry made a catastrophic decision en masse to cancel orders. And to me, that is a clear example of how there remains a lack of commitment, not even let alone living wages, but to be paying workers for work that's already done. A lot of the orders were already shipped or in process. And as we know, our industry operates on debt. So what that means is that if brands weren't going to honor the contracts, then workers were not going to be paid for work that is already done. And so us at Remake, along with many other civil society research organizations, essentially locked arms for our now viral Pay Up campaign. One of the things that was interesting in that campaign, where all said and done, we recovered upwards of 22 billion in canceled contracts from over 20 brands, is what, you know, reputational pressure of saying in a pandemic, how can you do this, and shining a light on this made a difference. A lot of sustainability, thoughtful folks working on the inside of brands told me it really helps for advocates and activists on the outside to really hold their feet to the fire, where they thought they'd sort of get away with this in a pandemic. So I think one is a lot of what we've seen is civil society and NGOs sort of getting closer and closer to brands, essentially being their contractors, if you will. And I think one way to really make progress when it comes to living wages to really be funding the advocacy and activism side of this work, to really be funding unionization, because really it is the people who are out there grassroots unionizing in the countries where we produce that have given us the most gains when it comes to wages. But one interesting thing with the Pay Up campaign was that we had a very unlikely bedfellow in terms of manufacturers locking arms with us as the labor movement to share order cancellation data, to share with us what was happening. And that helped us really go to bat. And there was a promise at the start of the pandemic around model contracts and contract clauses and having, you know, buyer's codes of conduct. And then the minute that we started to see orders flowing back, a lot of that solidarity went away. And so for a lot of our manufacturer partners, you know, listening in on this call, it's to say, we are only as good as the data that we have. And so if orders continue to drib and drab, and you feel that I have some orders, so perhaps I won't share the unfair commercial practices, as long as we're not shining a light on when payment terms are pushed out, when you are asked to be producing product at cost, when you're retroactively being asked for discounts, because all of that has an impact on wage levels. So we really need more agency and more imagination from the industry associations, the manufacturer industry associations here. A second example I'll give you is yeah. You have to get to questions, so I will turn it back to you. Somebody asked about free tools, and I'll drop our accountability report, which has a whole section on commercial practices, and it is a free tool as a contribution to the industry.
Thanks. I loved what you were saying. I love especially that you brought the word imagination into this. It's something I don't think we focus enough attention on in the sustainability space sometimes. But James, I saw you nodding your head. Maybe I could pass to you and maybe ask more about how the role of data and tech from your perspective can be complementary to different contextual approaches to this challenge. And yeah, what's your response to that?
Thank you, Faith. I wish we had more time.
Me too.
What a rich topic. So I'll try to be brief. I mean, I think the role of data is broad, but I'll point to the active role of data as creating a fact-based dialogue between brands and suppliers on the importance of fair wages as a key component of a scalable and sustainable sourcing relationship. The idea is to have a consistent and trusted reference point. That's all well and good, but unfortunately, and Ayesha mentioned this, and we're all aware of it, there's a ton of missing trust in these relationships, and there's a lot of excuses being made. We can read hundreds of stories from the last 3 years in particular, the supply chain crisis and the pandemic, canceled orders, unserved invoices, and that's just against a backdrop of continual excuses, and Ayesha and Tiffany have both mentioned that as well. Outside of even egregious behavior, I'll just highlight perhaps the elephant in the room, that brand engagement in the wages of their suppliers does not come naturally. It's sort of antithetical to the merchant mind. It's certainly not comfortable in the concept of cost of goods or retail price point. But my view is that the brands, and we're trying to provide the tools and the data to do this, the brands that actually counterintuitively lean hard into this, no matter how uncomfortable it is culturally or technologically, are ultimately going to win in the marketplace because they'll have created a much more sustainable business model, or at least they will with the right type of customer. But I just think it takes an act of courage. And thankfully, the tools from FLA and Remake and Higg and others are making that possible. Trusted data shows the opportunity for improvement. But here's the dark side of it. You can't use that data against your suppliers in price negotiation. I mean, that's just filthy. I'm going to use the word. So it requires courage to be ethical with that data, and instead do the opposite. Use it to unlock intervention opportunities and investment opportunities in your quote unquote strategic supplier. You can't embrace strategic suppliers and not at the same time embrace wage transparency and raising the water level. I will be
James,
clear.
would it be possible?
This is really important.
Sure.
Higg is not in the business of creating that good faith relationship. We're in the business of the data that makes it possible. We look to FLA and Remake and Transformers and Fairware to do that good faith relationship work. But I think there's a key partnership available there.
Thanks, James. I'm so sorry to interrupt you as you're speaking. I would love to continue listening, but something you said there, James, really resonated with me. It was the words courage and ethics. And I want to just hand over to you, Tiffany, just for maybe the closing comment for the panel, which is maybe on the pace of this work. And let me see, I think we all agree that this needs to happen quickly. And what do you think would improve that pace?
Sure. So what we've offered to everyone on this call and outside of this call as well is our wage tool. So when senior leadership comes back and asks, how will we collect this data? You have the tool to use it. But that's just one piece of the puzzle, as James and Ayesha have mentioned. I think, James, you've touched on something very important around not using this data against suppliers. And so at the Fair Labor Association, we consider our accreditation program as the way for companies to build their social compliance programs along with their audit programs so that they're improving transparency with their factories, improving their relationships and purchasing practices with their factories. And that's a multi-year process. It lasts about 5 years for a company to really transform its program. So it's building better relationships with factories and driving progress, not just on wages, but overall working conditions. And so there's a question around, how to get started in the chat and, things like that. And my first point is you have a tool now on our website. And you need to do the work internally to ensure that there's buy-in from top management to adopt standards that will uphold this right for workers in their factories. I think a lot of companies are, seeing the momentum and feeling like they need to catch up quick. So they're just starting to look at data tools and living wage estimates. But if you haven't actually adopted those standards internally and for your supply chain around upholding the right to fair compensation for workers, then you have kind of not great footing to get this work started and to have these conversations with suppliers on why you need to collect this data, why it's important to be transparent about it. And so I think we're picking up momentum on living wage, but it does mean that companies who haven't started really do need to invest in experience and expertise on living wage, and also how to develop relationships with suppliers so that they are transparent on the wage data. I think there's a question in the chat around how do we verify transparency, and if we're collecting it, we have our companies collect the wage data because that's the best way for us to ensure that we're not violating or ensure that we don't look like we're price fixing. So our companies are collecting that wage data, and we work with them through accreditation to strengthen their social auditing programs. And if they're using tools like with Higg or SLCP, that's all part of the program. We ensure that those tools are actually ensuring that they're being executed in a way that ensures transparency with suppliers, identifies violations, but also identifies opportunities to improve. Without that kind of foundation, it can be harder, but it can be done. There are some companies that we work with just with the dashboard that have that foundation, but have been doing this for many years. And so if you're a company that hasn't started living wage progress, or perhaps needs to strengthen its standards internally and commitment to workplace standards, I really just suggest that you come to Fair Labor Association, because we can support the great setup in improving workplace standards at the factory level. So I'll pass it back to you, Faith. I know there are questions in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I agree, this has been such a rich dialogue. I'm so grateful. I'm going to try and pick up some questions and take this as rapid fire answers if you can. And Ayesha, thanks for answering some of the audience's questions in chat as well. It's so valuable. I'm seeing a question on collaboration, and that really challenges the need to coordinate this work, which I think is very much in the spirit of this panel. So literally just a few words from each of you as to how the industry coordinates and doesn't duplicate this work. Start with Ayesha.
Look, I think coordination is important. We're stronger together. This is why we make all of our tools open source and are always willing to be working across industry.
Thank you. Tiffany?
Yeah, collaboration is key for us. That's why we joined the Global Living Wage Coalition Action Network. Within the FLA, our companies are collaborating with each other to give us feedback on how to improve the tools. And so that's something we also really rely on, especially for scalability and improving the data systems. So it's a must. I don't think you can do this work without collaboration.
Yeah. I have so much to say on that too, but I'll pass over to James. I mean, in terms of aligning efforts in this space, what have you got to say real quick on that?
The Higg platform of the future is one where our data is extending into other tools like Fair Labor, and data from other tools are coming into our platform. Like I said, we want data to come together so that all stakeholders can have visibility into what matters, and we think that'll enable much faster progress.
Love it. Thank you all. And now there's another question about the role of investors, which I thought was a pretty interesting spin. I mean, we haven't even really spoken that much about policy stakeholders in this conversation, which is a whole other debate, but investors, I feel like, is quite fascinating here too. So with the same snappy answers, maybe just go around the space. James, I see you nodding. What do you think about investors' role in this better wages mission?
I think it's fabulous, but ESG rating of public equities and impact investor ratings of private equities are going to need to get to much higher resolution of wage data. Right now, they're still dealing in broad strokes, and it's easy for big companies to hide behind that.
Ayesha, do you agree?
I agree. The S in ESG is small, and I think there's a lot of work to do to get it where it needs to happen. The other piece in this is that you have a lot of private equity gobbling up fashion brands, and that puts a whole other nuance around investor engagement.
Yeah, totally. Tiffany, you're nodding too. What do you think about the role of investment here?
Yeah, totally agree with Ayesha and James' contributions. I'd also like to add, I think there's been some great work on transparency from the investment community, but I'd like to see what they're doing to improve living wages. I mean, I think there needs to be better shareholder education on this because at the end of the day, factories need money to improve wages. That is just how it's going to be. And they need money to invest and to improve their systems. There was another question around the environmental kind of argument there, and there's a lot of focus about factories investing to improve their carbon emissions, water use, yada yada. That should in return give them some savings, but I don't think that will be all of it. And so we do need investors to actually put the money into the supply chain so that workers can earn more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that links back to something, Ayesha, you said earlier about really moving the risk. And it seems to be a parallel task to place the investment in different parts of the value chain too. Thank you so much. I'm going to pick up on a few more Q&As I've got popped up in this little box in front of me. This one's for Tiffany, but I'd invite everyone to contribute, and it's to talk more about the challenges for addressing living wage in multi-buyer contexts. So the different pathways for factories and brands interested in advancing when there might be resistance from either side. Thanks for all the questions, by the way, to the audience. Over to you, Tiffany, real quick.
Sure. So our pilot is focused on multi-buyer interventions because our case study found that actually where we were able to improve wages were in factories where the buyer had the majority production capacity. So we knew fashion industry has multi-buyer facilities, so we have to make sure we can showcase what solutions look like there. To the point of the question around, are there challenges? If some buyers want to advance and others do not, yes. When we onboarded our factories to the pilot, one of the questions we received was, can I bring some of my other buyers into this pilot? And, can they be involved in this as well? Because the factories really do need some coordination and agreement that the buyers are going to, uphold wages for workers. Without that, and with the continued downward pressure and pricing negotiations, factories are going to have a really hard time. So from my perspective, I think more and more factories are being better educated on this topic. And some buyers are leading the way in collecting data and having better conversations around how to improve wages. And so for those buyers that are not doing it, it may be that especially if you're a smaller and not a strategic buyer in that factory, you might get booted out, because if you're not meeting the minimums and you're not trying to uphold better conditions for the workers that will lead to hopefully less turnover and better efficiencies within the workplace, then you just might not be the buyer that factory wants in the future. And so that's kind of the reality that I would put out there.
Thanks for painting that picture. I am always blown away when I'm engaged in this conversation, the depth of intention, the difference in contextual approaches as well. I'm so grateful for you all for joining, and I really hope this has been useful for everyone in the audience as well. I want to round off this amazing panel really by, let's see, maybe just asking each of you if there's one thing. If we did this session a year from now, what would be the one thing that you wish we would have achieved, or the one thing you might wish to be talking about? This is another extremely difficult question to answer briefly, but as a closing word from each of you, let's start with Ayesha. Where does your mind go?
Yeah, we have the first fashion brand, Ghani, to sign a buyer code of conduct. And so if I were to talk to you 1 year later, I hope we have lots of brands that have model contracts and buyer codes of conduct. I also think the California bill, the Garment Worker Protection Act, which holds brands and retailers jointly liable for wage theft, that we just see joint liability as a core part of the regulatory conversation.
Thank you so much. Joint liability is a great round off as a keyword. Thanks for everything you've brought to this session, Ayesha. Over to you, James. What do you think we'll be talking about a year from now?
Well, I hope more and more of the conversations about living wages. Ayesha stole my answer a little bit. I'd love to see a lot of really clear case studies in Courage, like Ghani, what they're doing. And finally, I'd love to see big joint public commitments by groups of brands in a multi-buyer context. That's only half of it, though. The second half is that have serious legal, financial, and publicity penalties for violating their commitments. I would love to see brands get really serious about baking the wage conversation into their actual commercial negotiations with suppliers.
Thank you. And thanks for joining, James. And Tiffany, what do you think about the conversation a year from now?
Yeah, completely echo James and Ayesha's points. For FLA, Puma was our first company that started reporting on their living wage progress last year. And so I'm looking forward to more of our members reporting on their progress this year and into next year. And I do hope, along with what was already said, I really would like to start to talk more about how living wage can influence some of the environmental progress that we need to be focused on as well, along with what's happening in circular supply chains. I'm pretty concerned about that from a living wage perspective. So we'll continue to work on it with our members, but hoping to look at some of the kind of other sustainability initiatives and how that intersects with living wage.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm going to hand back over to Christina just to wrap up this masterclass. It's been my pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Faith. And thank you so much, everyone. This is incredible. I am just going to share my screen again. All right. So to close this masterclass, I just want to flag that we have 3 upcoming masterclasses as well about the last 3 priorities we haven't touched upon. I really hope you all want to enjoy. I think the representation we have had today in this masterclass, both for you great speakers, but also attendees, is enormous, and really, we're really appreciating that. Lastly, I want to say that we obviously have the Global Fashion Summit. So we really hope to see you there, because the discussion we have just had today, we'll have similar ones at the summit, where we really hope that change will happen after that. So keep staying in touch, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And lastly, but not least, when we share this with you, we will also include a survey. Yes. All right. Time's up.
Yep. See you at the next masterclass, everyone. And thanks again to our amazing panelists.
Yes.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.